Hi, everyone. This is Seth Abramson, and this is an Ask Me Anything audio regarding the House Judiciary Committee hearing with Attorney General William Barr that just happened today, Tuesday, July 28th of 2020. Just wrapped up about an hour ago. So you all have sent in a very large number of questions, scores of questions. It's heading towards hundreds of questions. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'll try and do the best I can to be succinct so I can get to as many of your questions as possible. So the first question I see here is Jeffrey asks, do you have any thoughts on how we might anticipate and diffuse the Barr/DOJ October surprise you alluded to earlier? That was a reference to the Durham report, which technically is exactly the sort of DOJ document that the DOJ is barred from releasing under Attorney General Barr's own edict prohibiting any election interference through investigations of campaign figures or their allies, donors, associates, and so on, or the candidates themselves, and also forbidding understanding DOJ policy, which we encountered back in 2016 with James Comey and the Hillary Clinton email investigation, prohibiting any DOJ interference with an election in the months leading up to the election. So the Durham report, which is a report that essentially was commissioned by Barr to investigate the investigators of the Trump-Russia investigation that began in 2015 and extended out until the Mueller report came out in 2019. William Barr, has asked for Attorney Durham to conduct a review of that investigation. And so a report has been pending for a very long time on that matter, and Barr today refused to say that he would not release that report prior to the election, even though it violates, as I said, his own edict about no investigations of candidates or associated figures, and this certainly is a report that will have to do with the Democratic Party, will have to do with the DNC, will have to do with alleged political conduct within the FBI. And also, as I said, it violates the DOJ edict that's been standing for some time about not interfering with elections. Barr is saying he will release that if he has it prior to the election. Donald Trump has already said publicly and privately that he wants to use that Durham report for political advantage. And so I referred to that as an October surprise on my Twitter feed that Barr is essentially forecasting for us. So Jeffrey's asking, is there anything we can do to anticipate and diffuse it? Well, one of the most important things to note is that Durham already reported out to the Department of Justice Inspector General Michael Horowitz that he couldn't find any evidentiary support for the claims being made by Trump, and that frankly had been made publicly and privately by Barr himself, that there was political bias involved in the Trump-Russia investigation, and specifically that there was nefarious conduct within the intelligence community directed against the Trump campaign for political reasons. So Durham has said that he can't substantiate that. He told Barr that. He told DOJ Inspector General Michael Horowitz that. And Attorney General Barr has rejected that statement from Durham and has rejected the findings of Michael Horowitz that there was no bias in the Trump-Russia investigation, saying that, this is Barr speaking, there could have been bias because Horowitz could have just missed finding it, essentially, is what Barr says. So how can we diffuse that report? Well, one of the things that can be done, and when I say we, I don't mean Democrats or politicos generally, I just mean the American people who read the news, know that Durham has already spoken on this issue, Michael Horowitz has already spoken on this issue, and anything that comes out in the Durham report that is other than what has already been said by Durham and Horowitz should be immediately under a cloud of suspicion as a political action by Barr at Trump's direction to deliver different results than Durham has already said he is able to deliver with the evidence that he has, and different results than the Horowitz investigation, which I will note was discussed during a private meeting with conservative allies by William Barr. This was reported on by major media, and William Barr said Horowitz is not the final word on this, even though in fact the Horowitz report was much touted by conservatives as in fact being the final word on a lot of this. So that's one thing that can be done to diffuse it. Another question that I have is, can we expect an impeachment proceeding resulting from Barr's performance today? And to be honest, I think the answer to that is no, we cannot. Nancy Pelosi has made very clear that she believes that the coming election is the way to deal with any complaints that Democrats may have about conduct within DOJ or within the executive branch more broadly or within the Trump White House. She does not support additional impeachment proceedings against either the president or William Barr. Now, the question is, would she still have that opinion should the Democrats take the White House and the Senate and the House, and we get a new attorney general, and we have for the first time a competent and full investigation, not just from the House managers who were very limited in the evidence they could access, but by DOJ itself and a new attorney general, looking into the actions of the Trump White House and also the prior DOJ, which generally speaking is not the sort of investigation that we would want to see. But in this case, with this historic level of malfeasance, I don't know that it would be avoidable to have a new attorney general, a new administration, and frankly, a new Congress look at some of these issues which were only glancingly treated with by the current DOJ, if at all, and by the current Congress. So yes, that wouldn't be an impeachment proceeding, but it could be a criminal investigation of William Barr for perjury or other offenses that I might talk about later on in this Q&A that are dealt with in my book, Proof of Conspiracy, as well as in my forthcoming book, Proof of Corruption, which comes out in September and deals with Barr in great detail. But no, we should not expect an impeachment proceeding while Barr is the sitting AG, no matter what the evidence suggests should be happening. So let's see. Someone notes here, Kevin says, I felt like there were too many speeches and not enough hard questions. If you had to pick just one question they failed to ask, what would it be and why? It's hard to pick just one question, Kevin, because there were so many questions that went unasked. There were entire topics, I would say 10 to 15 entire topics that were absolutely urgent for this hearing and went entirely unexplored. So one good example is that John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Donald Trump, said in his recent book, The Room Where It Happened, granted, what he put in that book were items and evidence that he should have provided to the country and to Congress at the impeachment trial in January. But he noted in that book that he had conversations with William Barr about the fact that Donald Trump was inserting his own personal business interests and personal relationships into foreign policy and national security decision-making. William Barr said in his opening statement today that Donald Trump would weigh in actively on open federal cases that dealt with foreign policy and dealt with national security. William Barr conceded that. I talked about this in a thread on my Twitter feed where I essentially broke down Barr's opening statement sentence by sentence. So this was a concession by Barr that whenever foreign policy or allegedly national security was involved in an open federal criminal case, so for instance, the Halk Bank case that involves Turkey, the Zareb case and the Gulen cases that involve Rudy Giuliani acting as an agent for Turkey and involve the Turkish government and Turkish President Erdogan's personal and professional and political interests specifically, we know that Donald Trump has said he has a conflict of interest with respect to Turkey, and we know that he saw those cases I just mentioned as having foreign policy components and national security components. And we know from Barr that whenever Trump observed that there were those components to cases, he would weigh in actively with his subordinates, people over whom he had authority, on the subject of those cases. So when Kevin asks if you had to pick just one question they failed to ask, well, honestly, I wish there'd been any questions about the Halk Bank case, the Gulen case, the Zareb case. If there were, I didn't hear them. Or questions about the ZTE case, which involves Donald Trump giving favorable treatment to a Chinese company in the midst of getting scores of trademarks from the Chinese government. There was specifically concern by Bolton about the ZTE case and the Halk Bank case, and that Trump was weighing in on those cases improperly. According to Bolton, William Barr agreed with him. Now, that was a conversation between Bolton and Barr. I don't know that there would be any claim of privilege that could be made for that sort of a conversation. It wasn't a conversation that Barr had with the president. It was a conversation he had with Bolton, and it was a conversation he had with Bolton about possible criminal conduct by the president. Barr wasn't asked about any of those cases, and that to me is shocking. But a whole second category of issues that were not explored today whatsoever is the personal, professional, political relationships that William Barr had with a group of people I discuss in Proof of Corruption as the quote-unquote BLT Prime team. BLT Prime is a restaurant in Donald Trump's Washington, D.C. hotel. And as Lev Parnas and many others have described, it has been a meeting place for Trumpists in government and also lobbyists and donors of Donald Trump for years now. And particularly, as I describe in Proof of Corruption, in the tail end of 2018, it became a regular meeting place multiple times a week for a specific team of people very close to Donald Trump, described as the BLT Prime team by Lev Parnas, a Trump donor, a Trump friend, at various points a Trump advisor, someone who aided the Trump campaign in many respects. We could go on and on about Lev Parnas. But he said that the BLT Prime team would meet regularly to discuss essentially how to get information from Ukraine about Joe Biden into the political jet stream in the United States. Now, as we know now, and frankly, as Barr himself intimated under oath today, that information was disinformation. Some of it was Kremlin disinformation. It was manufactured. Even some of the people in Ukraine, who Trump's allies were working with, now say that the evidence was not accurate, that in fact Joe Biden and his son did nothing wrong. But this BLT Prime team was, along with much else, in regular contact with William Barr. And so there should have been some questions about William Barr's relationship with Rudy Giuliani, who was on the BLT Prime team, Victoria Tonsing and Joe DeGenova, who are married, and they're longtime friends, as is Giuliani, of William Barr, and they were on the BLT Prime team, as well as with Devin Nunes, who didn't show up to the BLT Prime team meetings himself, but sent his aide, a top aide of his, in fact, his top aide, Derek Harvey, as his proxy. So there should have been questions about contact between Devin Nunes or Derek Harvey and William Barr, because it's clear that just as Barr has now formally set up a special intake process for any disinformation about Joe Biden that Rudy Giuliani or the rest of the BLT Prime team wants to bring to the DOJ's attention as alleged crimes, when in fact, as I noted, they're all disinformation and manufactured evidence that's false. And I deal with this in great detail in Proof of Corruption, so I'm not simply saying that out of school. There should have been questions about those contacts between Barr and those people, because besides that special intake process, Lev Parnas says that William Barr was being kept apprised in late 2018 and early 2019 through the spring of 2019 about what the team was finding. So there should have been a lot of questions about that. Let's see. So other questions. Assuming a change in presidency, Patty asks, with the election in November, can William Barr be prosecuted for violation of oath, dereliction of duty, and crimes against the people of the United States? How much jail time could he face? Thinking wishfully, says Patty. The crime that is most often discussed with respect to William Barr is certainly perjury, because he's testified a couple times under oath in ways that seemed to be perjurious. That is a difficult charge to bring and to prove. That's certainly true because it goes to state of mind, it goes to materiality, and so on. But it certainly appears, based on the evidence that we have, the facts that we know are true, the information that we know William Barr had and prepared prior to his testimonies before Congress, and then what he actually said, that he has made false statements. There's no question about that. And there's certainly evidence of him having criminal intent in making those statements. So perjury is rightly discussed as something that could be addressed. What I tend to think, given that Eric Prince appears to have committed perjury dozens of times in his congressional testimony, by now I'm trying to do the math, well over a year and a half ago, and no action has been taken whatsoever, that there are a lot of people, frankly, I would add Donald Trump Jr. to this list, whose testimony before congressional committees appeared to be filled with perjuries, and no action has been taken on that. Now, of course, no action's been taken because we're under the Trump DOJ run by William Barr. My point is rather to say there are a lot of perjury cases that a new DOJ and a new AG would have to initiate in 2021 if Joe Biden wins. And I think there would be a question sort of made in bulk, or an answer that would be addressed in bulk by the new AG, which is, am I going to pursue a slew of perjury cases for all the perjuries that we saw from Trump and his aides? And it wouldn't just be Prince and Trump Jr. and Barr. It would probably be over a dozen individuals associated with Trump world who arguably should have perjury cases brought against them for their testimony during the Trump-Russia and Trump-Ukraine investigations. Primarily, of course, the Trump-Russia investigation, as so many people were kept from testifying during the Trump-Ukraine investigation. There'd have to be a blanket determination. Are we going to bring all those cases, or are we going to just move on? I think, for me, the bigger question, and it is the more explosive question, and it's one that I address in my book, is whether William Barr participated in the Ukraine conspiracy and did so actively. In fact, aided and abetted the conspiracy that appears to have been enacted by Rudy Giuliani, Igor Fruman, Lev Parnas, Victoria Tonsing, Joe diGenova, and a slew of Ukrainian nationals to bring foreign election aid in the form of disinformation, and in some cases in the form of campaign cash, into the United States to aid Donald Trump. If William Barr was indicating that he was an open receptacle at DOJ to receive that information, knowing its provenance, which, based on all the evidence we have, he did know the provenance of that information, then he would be part of a conspiracy to solicit illegal foreign campaign donations. And a particularly egregious example of this, because it's a presidential election, and this was in the final year and a half of the run-up to that presidential election. And so that is the sort of offense which is idiosyncratic, historic, cannot be ignored, does not sit as part of a large volume of perjury cases that, as I said, I think you almost have to make a decision about in bulk one way or another, but becomes something that can't be looked away from. And so that wasn't addressed in today's hearing, but in answer to Patty's question, if we do have a change in presidency, I do think that that's the sort of investigation that I would like to see happen, that should happen, and the sort of charges that appear to be warranted based upon the evidence that we have. I don't think you would see a prosecution for things like, as Patty mentions, violation of oath, dereliction of duty. Those are the sorts of offenses that in some cases are non-criminal offenses that would be raised during an impeachment hearing. And as I already said, I don't think that we'll be seeing one. How much jail time could William Barr face? I mean, that really depends upon whether the Ukraine conspiracy is fully investigated and revealed. I think I do that, self-aggrandizingly, I'll say, but I do think I do that in the book Proof of Corruption. But what is certainly needed is a full FBI, DOJ, quite possibly special counsel investigation into the Trump-Ukraine conspiracy. And certainly anyone charged with conspiracy out of that investigation would be looking at federal prison time. Steven says, or he asks me, did Barr say anything flat out impeachable? What would that process look like? Does it have a chance of succeeding? Yeah, I think most of his answers, Stephen, on the protests and his handling of the protests suggest abuse of power. I think he gave false answers to some of the questions. I mean, even a single false answer arguably is impeachable. Even a single instance of Barr working at the direction of the president or under the influence of the president and claiming that he is not would potentially be impeachable. I think Barr not being able to identify any cases besides those affecting the president's and his friends' interests in which he acted in certain ways while claiming he wants there to be one system of justice in America are exactly the sort of extraordinary interference in our judicial process and our prosecutorial processes that you might expect would lead to an impeachment, as well as his abuse of power in deployment of federal agents quite selectively, and frankly, in many cases, in contradiction of FBI data, FBI investigations about who is causing violence at a small number of these protests. And again, I just want to circle back actually to the perjury thing to just give one example. you had William Barr repeatedly saying that his agents are not leaving federal property, that they are at the courthouse behind fences in a defensive position, and all of their actions have been taken in that context. In the same way that William Barr has publicly lied about what happened in Lafayette Square at the end of May, beginning of June of this year, calling it very serious rioting, where all the videos suggested that, in fact, there was no rioting going on at all, when he deployed, and it was him who did this, federal troops to violently clear that street so that Donald Trump could have a photo op with an upside-down Bible. In the same way, William Barr, I'm sure, is aware of and has seen and had shown to him and seen on television video of his agents patrolling the streets of Portland, parks, streets that might be in the general vicinity of the federal courthouse, though I think in some instances they're not, but certainly are not on federal property behind a fence. And during those roving patrols his agents have participated in, and that we've all frankly seen happen on television and read about in major media reports, there has been the gassing of peaceful protesters as well as non-peaceful protesters by federal agents off federal property. William Barr, let's understand, prepares for these congressional appearances and also has access to information well beyond what we have in major media and what we have in videos posted on Twitter. So if we all know that these federal agents are well outside federal property in roving patrols where they are attacking and in many cases arresting and putting in unmarked vans peaceful protesters or people certainly who they have not personally seen engage in any criminal conduct, and then he's going to Congress and under oath he's saying, all my agents are behind the fence, that's perjury. So that would be one example. Let's see. Why does Congress never slam administration officials with contempt of Congress and or perjury? I think you'd have to ask Nancy Pelosi, but it appears that the answer is purely political, and I do discuss this a little bit in my book, some of the backroom conversations that were happening between Nancy Pelosi and Democratic leadership in the House. Norm Eisen's book, which just came out, the case against Donald J. Trump, certainly goes into some detail about all the political considerations that were happening behind the scenes in bringing the articles of impeachment. That goes as much or more so for bringing criminal charges against a government official. It's fundamentally a political matter. I think that that's damaging to the rule of law. I think it's dangerous for our democracy when lawyers across the country by the tens of thousands are publicly saying on social media, in letters, in editorials, in conversations around the water cooler, look, these would be offenses if anyone else committed them. And then in the next breath saying, yeah, but nothing will be done about it because of politics. I think that's really damaging to the country and it's damaging to our rule of law. I think it's the wrong approach that Nancy Pelosi has taken in this respect, because if you tell me to rank rule of law and politics 1, 2, rule of law is going to be number 1, and politics is going to be such a distant second that you can't even cite it from the finish line. Yet it somehow seems to be a horse race in the mind of Nancy Pelosi, and pretty consistently, unless there is really a volume of evidence that she can't ignore, as happened with the Trump-Ukraine matter, a very narrow aspect of the Trump-Ukraine matter, she opts for politics. And so I like Nancy Pelosi in many respects, but I do have to criticize her and be honest and candid in that respect, that yes, some of these administration officials should have been slammed with perjury charges. Certainly someone like Eric Prince should have been. But of course, the charges would really have to come from DOJ. So when I talk about Nancy Pelosi, I'm really talking about whether Congress is pushing for publicly these charges, which they're not. In the final event, they would ultimately have to be brought in most cases, not through impeachment, but by charges brought by the very same DOJ that in some cases is aiding and abetting or participating in these perjuries. Contempt of Congress is a separate question. Contempt of Congress, I can't go into the whole detail here. It's a little bit too confusing, but it's incredibly hard to do anything and enforce anything about a statement of finding someone in contempt of Congress unless you want there to be a constitutional crisis, a balance of power crisis, where the legislative branch uses the sergeant at arms to attempt to arrest and bring to Congress someone who is in contempt of Congress. We saw this with certain Trump officials who were, like Steve Bannon, who were refusing to testify at various points during the Trump presidency. It's a tool that Congress has that is almost never used, and it's almost never used because it would immediately lead to a constitutional crisis, and it's not clear who would win in that battle between the branches, particularly with the Supreme Court as it's constituted right now. So I think a lot of Democrats think that could be a dead end. Someone asked here, isn't Kamala Harris on the committee? Did I miss her questioning? The answer is no. Kamala Harris is in the Senate, and this was the House Judiciary Committee. Does Barr's testimony really matter, Michael asked. Will it change anything or cause anything to change or happen? No, I don't think that it matters in any sense other than the cathartic. I think a lot of Americans are feeling a little crazed right now, and I mean that in the best way. They are properly indignant, properly and understandably bewildered at the lack of justice for all the malfeasance that we're seeing in the Trump administration. And from a certain standpoint, I do think there is a public utility. There's a communal necessity to us seeing play out on our television screens on occasion people who we have elected to office and who we have some respect for in a televised, nationally available way, demonstrating that reality still exists, demonstrating that the rule of law still exists, demonstrating that common sense and basic standards of decency and the rule of law exist. And so events like this, more than anything, are cathartic opportunities for us to see someone get chastised in that way. Now, I want to be very clear and say, I only think you need a very little bit of that. You don't need every questioner on the House Judiciary Committee to give a speech for 5 minutes. That's certainly not useful, and we frankly see far too much of that. You do also need some really incisive questioning of these witnesses. And on occasion, I'd say maybe 2 or 3 times during this entire hearing, you get an answer that's somewhat significant. And I sort of went through a couple of those on my Twitter feed as the hearing was happening. But by and large, because under a Republican administration, a Republican attorney general can commit perjury, can dissemble, can evade, can essentially refuse to answer questions, can repeatedly pretend that he can't hear questions just from Democratic questioners, can speak far more slowly when he's answering questions from Democratic questioners, can pretend not to know evidence that we know he knows, can pretend not to be familiar with things that he previously said, can pretend that he doesn't read the president's tweets, when in fact we know that he does, and in fact he certainly read the Mueller report, or he must have, before he said that it was bunk, and the Mueller report lays out a lot of Donald Trump's tweets, particularly with respect to Roger Stone and Paul Manafort and others. A Republican attorney general can do that in a Republican administration, knowing that there will be no consequences. And so that's why I think there is a little bit of value to the cathartic moments in these hearings, because any time that William Barr really finds himself to be in some danger of having to commit perjury or else tell the truth, and it's an unacceptable truth that he doesn't want to tell, which is usually why people commit perjury, he can always just not answer the question. Or frankly, if he wants to, he can just commit the perjury and know that he'll probably be fine. And so that's why very little actually comes out of these hearings. Let me see some other questions. Tifa asks, what do you think the most important revelations were today? Which do you think have the strongest potential criminal implications for Barr and or Trump? What do you think the biggest missed opportunities were over the course of the questioning? So I answered some of that, so I'll just focus on the first part. What do I think the most important revelations were today? So I sort of mentioned some of those things on my feed. One of the things that I talked about, and I want to make sure I sort of lay out exactly what I sort of put on my Twitter feed and who was asking the questions. So I already discussed Bill Barr refusing to promise not to release the Durham report in a way that could interfere with the election. I think that that's significant. I do think that there was questioning by Representative Joe Neguse, hopefully I'm saying his last name correctly, a Democrat of Colorado, who got William Barr to say that the information that was coming from Ukraine about Joe Biden was in many cases disinformation that was coming from corrupt sources. And he answered that question in the context of talking about his special intake process for information coming from Rudy Giuliani. So when you take the context of what he's discussing and then what William Barr actually says today to the representative from Colorado, he is saying that some percentage, perhaps even a significant percentage, of the information that Rudy Giuliani was bringing in from Ukraine came from corrupt individuals in Ukraine and was disinformation. Now, that's quite an allegation to make against the president's lawyer, particularly because the president's lawyer was acting at the president's direction, which means that the president was directing a scheme by which information was coming, disinformation about Joe Biden into the United States from corrupt officials in Ukraine. And those officials were so corrupt and the disinformation was so dangerous that, according to William Barr, he actually had to create this special intake process to protect the rule of law in the United States. Now, if you put all of that together, you've certainly got not just an impeachable offense, but a conspiracy involving the president and involving William Barr to the extent that Barr was actually facilitating what Giuliani was doing, and involving Giuliani to solicit, as I spoke of before, illegal election assistance in the run-up to the 2020 election. I do think that events are so confusing right now, and there are so many different narratives that dissemblers like the president and like William Barr and Rudy Giuliani have to keep in mind at once. There's such a collapse in their principles that it is very easy for them to contradict themselves, to make confessions and concessions that they don't mean to make, and to actually provide evidence of criminal conduct, and to even accuse one another of criminal conduct as well as just unethical conduct on a regular basis in answers that a lot of people would normally miss and not think much about, because particularly with William Barr, they're delivered so reasonably. Barr did lose his cool a number of times today. There's no question about that. And I will say candidly that, this witness today certainly had less time to answer questions before his answers were cut off than most witnesses you're going to see. So a small amount of his upset is certainly understandable. But most of the time, William Barr, when testifying, is able to keep his cool and give answers that sound to most people very reasonable, and you don't realize that, in fact, he's saying something striking, as was the case with the answers that he gave to the representative from Colorado. So besides just going back again and mentioning the statement that Barr made about the Durham report, and also the statement that Barr made about whether federal agents have left federal property to engage in police actions in Portland, I would also mention the questioning by the Democratic representative from Rhode Island, which was about whether it was okay for a presidential candidate to accept election assistance from foreign nationals. It's one of the easiest questions you could ever ask to an attorney general of the United States, simply because there's a federal statute on point on this question. And I think it's actually stunning. It is newsworthy. It is breaking newsworthy that the Attorney General of the United States asked about whether a federal criminal statute essentially exists on this point and is quite clear that you can't accept any foreign election assistance. Barr said, well, what type of aid do you mean? And he may have been asking that question for a lot of different reasons. One is that one of the primary forms of election aid, but certainly not the only and certainly not the most criminal or egregious, that Donald Trump received in 2016 was that his campaign was being advised by a large number of foreign nationals. Ron Dermer, the ambassador from Israel to the United States, Yusuf al-Otaiba, the ambassador from the United Arab Emirates to the United States, were advisors to Trump's campaign. My understanding of this under federal law is that that would be considered illegal to the extent that there is valuable content and there is absolutely value in having that sort of direct conduit on a regular basis from foreign governments as you're running for president. I don't think that having conversations with foreign nationals, of course, runs afoul of the statute. But when they are regularly advising you and when you are pre-negotiating in violation of the Logan Act, American policy with these individuals, that's when you run into the situation that Donald Trump and Chris Christie and Michael Flynn were briefed about on August 17th of 2016, when they were told, look, foreign agents are going to approach you and they're going to want to know the future of U.S. policy. And they're going to offer you things that you need. And that's the sort of relationship that clearly was established with Dermer and al-Otaiba and some others. And then also someone who was American, but now actually works for the Kremlin as a propagandist, which is Dimitri Simes. of the Center for the National Interest, who was Trump's top Russia advisor and who Vladimir Putin has called a quote-unquote friend. He was a top advisor to Jared Kushner and to the Trump campaign on the matter of Russia. So that may have been why Barr was hesitating, but I think it's much more likely, given that Ukraine has interceded in all of our imaginations between us and the Trump-Russia investigation, that in fact what William Barr was thinking about were all the efforts that he made alongside his friends Giuliani, DeGeneva, and Tonsing and the BLT Prime team to facilitate valuable disinformation. I know that seems like an oxymoron, but disinformation, when it's backed by fake documents and fake testimony and is about your Democratic opponent, is incredibly valuable. And it's already been ruled by DOJ in the past and in other cases. Information, including information that's not true, has political value. And so I'm sure that William Barr's initial hesitation to answer, yes, it's always a problem, is because he knew about the June 9th, 2016 meeting with Kushner, Manafort, and Donald Trump Jr., and all those Kremlin agents, specifically Natalia Veselnitskaya, who showed up at Trump Tower. And Michael Cohen says that Donald Trump himself knew about this meeting, and they offered information to the Trump campaign. So he might have been thinking about that. He might have been thinking about Ukraine in sort of hesitating, but that was shocking because the answer is simply no, it's not acceptable. It's never acceptable. The rare instances in which you would think it non-chargeable would be a single conversation with a foreign national in which policy is discussed. I mean, certainly El-Sisi, the president of Egypt, had a conversation, so did Netanyahu, with both of the political candidates in 2016. No one's saying that those conversations are illegal, but I think Barr fully understood he wasn't being asked about those incidental contacts. He was being asked about actual aid of value being provided, and he hesitated, and I do think that's telling because of how much is going to come out in my book, Proof of Corruption, in September, and also just generally about what Barr has done in conjunction with Trump, his boss, and three longtime friends, Giuliani, DeGeneva, and Tonsing. So let's see what other questions we have here. Gotta find my way back to the post. I somehow have moved off it. Let's see. I mean, so many people are asking, to be honest, questions that I've already answered because, and I'm not being critical there. They're frankly the most important questions. They're the ones that I think any American would ask watching what we've just seen. And so I have a lot of questions here about perjury, about impeachment of Barr, and so on. What are the chances of impeachment? Did Barr commit perjury? I mean, it's sort of the same questions. What's the October surprise? That's something that I've covered. Does his testimony really matter? Something that I've talked about. Can he be prosecuted? Something that we've already discussed. How hard would it be for the Democrats to hire a question coordinator? I definitely think that both Republicans and Democrats make a very deliberate decision about when they want to have someone who's counsel to their committee do the questioning and when they don't. When they want counsel to do the questioning is when they really are in a fact-finding, evidence-gathering position, and they're on that particular footing in that particular hearing. So we saw a lot of that in the impeachment inquiry in the fall of 2019 involving the Trump-Ukraine scandal. In a hearing like this, no proceeding is contemplated. No impeachment proceeding, as I've discussed, no perjury investigation is seriously being considered. And therefore, I think we can tell from how the conduct of the hearing unfolds that the House Judiciary Committee does not see itself really as being on a fact-finding mission, in an evidence-gathering footing. And for that reason, they don't want to hire a question coordinator, by which I assume this questioner means why don't they just have the counsel or deputy counsel to the committee do the questioning and just have one questioner. They don't want that. And that's a format, in some cases, I think you actually have to agree with other committee members, possibly across the aisle, that you're going to do it that way. Certainly the Republicans have no interest in that happening here. But you'd think that the Democrats would, because that leads to more effective questioning. It leads to better fact-finding. But as I mentioned before, in some cases, what we were getting here, and maybe what some of us were looking for here, because we knew not much else would come from it, was simply the cathartic moment of hearing someone confront William Barr with all that he has done, all that Trump has done, the damage they've done to the rule of law, the Department of Justice, and our democracy. So Would it be hard for them to have one person ask them questions? No. Is there a reason they don't do that? Yes, there certainly is. Glenn asks, how come you don't have your own spot or show on one of the networks yet? I won't spend much time on this question, except to say you have to keep in mind, Glenn, certainly some element of how much media someone does has to do with how often you're asked, and some of it has to do with how much you want to do. I get asked to do a lot of media. Only some of the media requests do I accept. And part of that is because I think that there are stronger and weaker formats for presenting information to American voters and to sort of participating in discourse. There are certainly times when I question the value of a 4 to 6 minute hit on CNN or MSNBC to sort of give a small number of sound bites on really complex issues. I'm an author, so I tend to find long-form writing, books that are like the 3 books of the Proof series, epic, fully sourced works that spare no complexity whatsoever to crowbar themselves into an artificial form like a 4 to 6 minute interview. So I've done hits with CNN. I've been asked on MSNBC 12 times. They've canceled 12 times. That's its own story. But I don't know what the utility is relative to, let's say, doing something like this where I can answer something in more long form. I do like radio and podcasts, though, for exactly that reason, and I try to do those when I'm asked as much as I can, because that's long form. And you really get some value being able to talk about all the complexities of a thing. Let's see. 27 D.C. lawyers recently submitted a 40-page ethics complaint, a writer notes, to the D.C. Bar against William Barr. If Barr is disbarred or has his law license suspended, can he continue to serve as Attorney General or must he step down? This is a topic that's been under a lot of conversation recently because there is this effort to disbar William Barr. I think the easiest answer to give is a little bit of a cop-out, which is to say that the disbarment process takes so long that William Barr would no longer be Attorney General by the time it's completed. So even if a filing was made with the D.C. Bar right now, I don't think that you could really expect action to be taken prior to January 20th of 2021. And so it would only be in the case that Donald Trump was reelected, in which case if he's reelected, I imagine he would very much want to keep William Barr as Attorney General, that we would be dealing with the concluding portions of any disbarment action before the D.C. Bar involving William Barr. But as to whether he's allowed to continue to serve as Attorney General, I think I'd want to read up more on that to better understand it. I have certainly seen people say that you don't have to be a lawyer to be Attorney General. I don't know whether that's true. I'd want to see whether that's accurate. What I would note is that the Attorney General in many respects is in a supervisory role. He's not doing a lot of in-court appearances. In fact, probably virtually no in-court appearances, either at the trial level or the appellate level. He's fundamentally an administrator. So I wouldn't be shocked if I looked into it and saw that those claiming that you don't have to be an attorney to be the Attorney General are in fact correct, because you simply, in many respects, have to be a bureaucrat. And what it comes down to with William Barr is that he's exactly that. He's an incredibly corrupt bureaucrat who has violated our ethical understanding of what it means to be an attorney, to be the Attorney General, to work as a public servant, and to swear an oath to the U.S. Constitution, as he has done, and as I have done, and as every attorney has done. So I haven't focused much on the disbarment proceedings that could, in theory, be initiated against Barr, because I just think, practically speaking, they won't be of really any import to the election or to anything that happens with the protests, or to whether Barr can be stopped in what he is doing anytime soon, if at all, if Donald Trump is reelected. Bertrand says, Barr suggested there's no policy regarding release of the Durham report before the election. Is this true? I want to just underscore what I said previously, which is, no, it's not true. That is certainly an investigation touching upon the election, and therefore would be, no pun intended, barred by the Attorney General from being, frankly, conducted in the first instance in the run-up to an election, let alone having a report be issued and having it be released. It's not even clear that that investigation would be permissible under Barr's very special edict intended to protect Donald Trump explicitly in the run-up to the 2020 election. But then also there's standing DOJ policy. And as I mentioned, we dealt with this in 2016 with Jim Comey and the Clinton email investigation about not interfering in the months before a presidential election. And unless the Durham report is going to come out and say nothing was found in terms of any misconduct by anyone in law enforcement, it's hard to see how it wouldn't interfere with the election. And I think you could even argue that a report that exculpates everyone is an attempt to interject a new discourse into the election in a way that's unacceptable. But William Barr has made very clear that he has demanded a certain result in this investigation, and that the result be that people be found within the FBI not just to have made errors, but to have acted unethically. And not just to have acted unethically, but to have acted unethically with political animus against Donald Trump specifically. And therefore, any Durham report that William Barr is willing to sign off on is going to be a report that says that there is a deep state conspiracy within federal law enforcement targeting the Republican candidate for president in 2020. That is election interference by the DOJ to issue a report that says that, to interject that as a line of rhetoric and debate in the 2020 presidential election absolutely violates standing DOJ policy. So no, that was not just incorrect. That certainly was an act of perjury by William Barr, as he's aware of his own edicts. He's legally responsible to know his own edicts, even if he wants to say later he momentarily forgot what he did. And he certainly, as the Attorney General, knows about, is responsible to know about standing DOJ policy regarding election interference, particularly because he spent the last 4 years complaining that that policy was violated with the Trump-Russia investigation. So we know his state of mind in terms of having access to the information about what is or isn't allowed on this score. Let's see. How many times did he perjure himself today? I'd have to review the tape to give an exact accounting of that, Dennis. Dennis asks that question. But I think let's look at it from this standpoint. If William Barr were you or me, just an average citizen who has encyclopedic knowledge of a particular organization and responsibility for having that level of knowledge, and then does countless hours of preparation with a staff paid for by taxpayers to make sure that he has access to correct information and immediate recall of correct information while testifying before Congress. If you or I were in that position, but just as regular people, and we went in and we swore an oath to tell the truth under penalty of perjury, and then we gave the testimony that William Barr gave today, I think we could expect, if there wasn't a political component to the question, that we might face 10, 20, or perhaps more counts of perjury for this testimony that unfolded over the span of a few hours before Congress. Now, I know that sounds really wild to people because we've been trained by, frankly, the way criminal justice system analysis is provided by the media, sometimes even with the best of intentions, to look at everything through the lens of two systems of justice. We have certain expectations for how regular folks will be treated, and we don't necessarily have very high expectations for how well they'll be treated or how much leeway they'll be given by federal law enforcement. We all have stories of friends, relatives, or ourselves, or stories that we read in media of people being mistreated by law enforcement in many different ways. So our expectations are not that high. And then somehow we have sky-high expectations for what the fair treatment of the rich, the powerful, and the famous will be. Because, frankly, we've watched those cases on TV. We've read those books about people getting away with things because they're rich, powerful, and famous that none of the rest of us would. As a longtime public defender, when I started participating in public discourse about the criminal justice system right towards the tail end of my time with the Public Defender's Office in New Hampshire, so this would be around 2006, I committed myself to not providing analysis of the criminal justice system that honors that distinction between the rich, the powerful, and the famous, and the rest of us. I resolved myself to give analysis that would be the proper constitutional and statutory analysis for any American, no matter what their station or their standing. So when I say William Barr would be charged with 10, 20, 24 counts of perjury, for what he said today, that's going to sound wild to a lot of people because you say, Seth, that would never happen. And I agree with you. It wouldn't ever happen because we do live in a country with two systems of justice. But in a country where the rule of law applied equally to all, Donald Trump would have been impeached. Donald Trump would have already been indicted. Donald Trump would be probably either awaiting trial or perhaps already been sentenced on a slew of offenses. And the same is true for Donald Trump Jr., and the same is true for many others in his administration. That all sounds wild to people. And it's a great advantage for the rich, the powerful, and the famous that statements like the one I just made sound wild to people. They get to discredit people like me by saying you're living in a fantasy land. What they don't understand is I'm simply having a conversation from the reality in which America lives by its principles and upholds rule of law, which seems to them like an alternate reality because in the reality that they inhabit and that sometimes I must inhabit when I have conversations like this, there are two systems of justice and we treat William Barr very differently from everyone else. Let's see, other questions. I really am seeing a lot of the same questions. I'm not trying to skip over a lot of what people have asked, but I think we've actually covered a lot of this. Did Barr admit it was okay to tear gas peaceful protesters under what circumstances? So Brenda asked this question, and I'm trying to remember exactly what Barr said on this score. I believe what he said is that it is appropriate in some instances to tear gas individuals who are not peaceful protesters, and peaceful protesters might get caught up in that tear gassing. That's my recollection of what he said. That's my best recollection, and I think I have that right. What we should all understand is that his agents, both in D.C., Lafayette Square, and in Portland, and I'm sure very soon elsewhere, it's possibly already happening in Seattle at the local level, and I'm sure will happen more in Kansas City and Jacksonville and Chicago and New York and Seattle once federal agents fully deploy there. Tear gas is being applied liberally against nonviolent, peaceful protesters who are just exercising their First Amendment rights. We've seen the video of it happening. Frankly, William Barr has seen the video of it happening. So whatever his view is of when it's appropriate to use tear gas, agents under the color of his authority and his direction, as well as agents under the authority of DHS, are routinely violating what he said is the appropriate use of tear gas. I'll note, and I talk about this in Proof of Corruption a lot, that what DHS and the DOJ and frankly the Trump administration broadly writ in the executive branch has done is consistently lie when they are first accused of using tear gas in a given instance. Over and over again. The first time they're accused of using tear gas, they lie. Usually the second time, the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, and the eighth time, they also lie about using tear gas at all. Not even how it was deployed, but whether they've even used it. It's only when reporters find the canisters, when they have a whistleblower, when they talk to enough protesters who all say they were tear gassed, when they look at any relevant sort of medical reports, that they go back to the Trump administration, DHS, CBP, whoever it is, DOJ, ICE, the Federal Protection Service, and DC Park Police, and they get people to say, well, you know what, there might have been some tear gas. Though there's an intermediary stage, and we saw this recently, where the Trump administration says, well, depends on what the meaning of tear gas is. A sort of callback to the old Clinton, depends on what the meaning of is. There actually was a dispute over what qualifies as tear gas, and the Trump administration lied about even that semantic dispute, but eventually they had to concede, yes, we did use tear gas. Now you see here today, William Barr conceding that tear gas may have been used in certain instances, though he also questions whether tear gas was used in instances in which he clearly knows that it was. But then he lies about how it's being deployed. But what he presents to America, what he's hoping the takeaway will be is, oh, I have a very reasonable policy on when you should use tear gas, which is use it against violent protesters. If nonviolent protesters get caught up in it, that's unfortunate, but it wasn't intended for them. None of that has any connection to reality. None of it has any connection to what we've seen on our televisions or read in major media. Let's see. You know, I'm going to mention that I see Silas says that testimony was tedious. It ran exactly like all hearings since Mueller. It was partisan AF. I think we all know what AF stands for. I'm an ardent Democrat and a Seth fan. Thank you, Silas. But I really thought Dems did no favors constantly talking over Barr. Your thoughts? I agree with you, Silas. I'm a big believer in process. I'm a big believer in decorum whenever possible. I want to quickly append to that the rules of these hearings are preposterous, and they're set up in such a way that makes these hearings largely useless. The idea that you're going to give everyone a chance to ask questions, there's only going to be 5 minutes for questions, everyone's time is constantly running out, is just insipid and silly and stupid and offensive to any right-thinking person who believes in actual oversight by Congress. So I do think that some of the talking over witnesses that both parties do, depending upon their interests in a given hearing, happens because the hearings are set up in a stupid way. Now, they're partly set up in a stupid way because every politician wants to have their 5 minutes to be on television, and so they are really responsible for the stupidity of their own procedures. But there are probably others. There are probably some people who are on these committees who would prefer to have counsel be asking questions. One counselor for both sides, as we saw during the impeachment inquiry, asking all the questions. And then you get a lot less talking over for a lot of reasons. One, you don't have grandstanding, but number two, you're specifically trying to get answers that can be used potentially to be used as evidence in some future impeachment proceeding or congressional investigation or even criminal prosecution. And that's why you have one person asking the questions. That's why you don't talk over the witness, because you don't want to cut their answers short. As someone who has done a lot of trials, conducted a lot of cross-examinations, and I know any attorneys listening to this will feel the same way, it's actually infuriating to hear even some of the most talented, often legally trained congressmen and congresswomen asking questions of witnesses, and they're about to get an answer that would be very helpful for the narrative that they are presenting, the accurate narrative that they're presenting, and they talk over the witness as they're getting the answer that they want. I think that's bad for America. I think that's bad for the member of Congress. I think that's bad for fact-finding. I think it's bad for decorum, and it's bad for procedure. So yes, I think all around, this doesn't look good for Congress. It's why Congress generally has a lower approval rating than head lice and root canals, which you can look that up. Generally speaking, they do have a lower approval rating, and it's spectacles of this sort. I don't lay that specifically at the feet of Democrats or Republicans. I lay it at the feet of Congress that has allowed these rules to subsist for basically political reasons regarding how you conduct a hearing of this sort. As I said, I do think it riles up the base in a way that's probably earnestly and genuinely cathartic and deserved, frankly, given that we all get gaslit every day by this president and by this attorney general. But no, I don't think fundamentally it restores anyone's confidence in politics or justice or rule of law or our ability in the United States to adhere to any serious process on serious matters, either in a courtroom, in a hearing room in Congress, or anywhere else. So I only am going to do about a couple minutes more because we're running up against an hour. Someone asks, why is it okay to send federal mercenaries to cities with Democratic mayors? That's a great question, and it's the first time I've seen that question. And the reason it's a great question is if you were going to impeach a president for abusing his power by deploying federal agents to quell protests of his presidency and to do so through unconstitutional, in many cases criminal, unethical means, all three of those, unconstitutional, criminal, and unethical, and if you then say, I'm only going to deploy to places that are run by Democrats, meaning where I am superseding the local policing authority and the local policing needs and interests of individuals who are being overseen by Democrats, my political opponents, at a time when I am using the Democratic Party's position vis-a-vis crime as a political cudgel to try to win re-election, you're going to have a pretty strong case for abuse of power if you can show that individuals were deployed federal agents only to cities run by Democratic mayors. And that's what's happened here. And this is another one of those instances in which Donald Trump basically just confesses to the crime outright in interviews. He openly says this is about Democrat mayors. Obviously, the correct adjective is democratic. But in his interviews, he says these are Democrat mayors. And he seamlessly folds this abuse of power into his political campaign, making very clear that official U.S. policy, official actions of the executive branch are geared not towards national interests, but towards his reelection, which is not just abuse of power, but it's a violation of his oath of office. You would think if you were even Roy Cohn and basically a criminal who happens to have a law degree, the late Roy Cohn, and you were advising Donald Trump to either commit these crimes and these unconstitutional acts, or at least trying to give him license to do so, you'd tell him to sprinkle in 1 or 2 cities run by Republicans, just so that he wouldn't be so obvious about breaking the law, violating his oath of office, engaging in abuse of power, acting unethically, acting counter to the national interests of the United States, and misusing taxpayer resources, because we pay all of these people to tear gas us in our streets and help Donald Trump's reelection. They're on our payroll. So, no, it's not okay. This question is, why is it okay to do that? It's not okay. And even if you were a mob lawyer, you would tell Donald Trump not to do it. But again, Nancy Pelosi has decided that in a horse race between politics and rule of law, which of course shouldn't be a horse race at all, politics comes out more than a nose ahead. And therefore, it's not the right time to try to impeach the president again or impeach William Barr. Let's see. I'll try to do one more. This will be a quick one. Why is Nadler the chair of this committee? He's horrible. It works on a seniority system. There's a lot of intra-party politics over who gets to be committee chair of what committee. And so I think it's the case really on every committee, on both sides of the aisle, that the person who's running the committee is not necessarily, there are exceptions to this, but not necessarily the most fiery, engaged, articulate, well-informed, hopefully legally trained individual who could be sitting in that seat. Fortunately, there are some very talented people who were asking questions today, and I've mentioned a few of them. I mean, if you watch today, you certainly know who they are. And you can tell the difference very quickly between someone who's done their homework, someone who has legal training, someone who's actually trying to find facts and gather evidence rather than just make a speech. And I certainly agree that Nadler tends to fall in the sort of hinterland that isn't really effective as a questioner or, frankly, as a demagogue or a lecturer or an educator of the people or a radical wizard. He's not really in any of those camps. Having said that, I'm just starting to read it now, but I do think that Norm Eisen's new book does talk about the fact that Nadler really pushed hard for rule of law to be put ahead of politics in consideration of articles of impeachment. So I think Nadler is a man of principle. He's probably not the best person to have the gavel or to be the face of the House Judiciary Committee in that respect, but I think he often argued on the side many of us would take in the backroom debates about whether Donald Trump will be held to account and whether our rule of law and our democracy will be upheld or treated as a sort of backseat entity that falls well behind political considerations. I would be remiss if I don't say just one more time, speaking of books, I mentioned Norm Eisen's. So far, it's pretty good. My own book, Proof of Corruption, comes out September 8th from Macmillan. You can pre-order it now. It deals with all of these topics and dozens more. It's almost 600 pages, and those who have seen it, say that it's sort of like 10 books in one because it covers so much ground, so many decades, so much crime, so many continents, so many relationships transnationally between Donald Trump and China, Turkey, Israel, Ukraine. The list goes on, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, as well as a lot of these domestic topics, the protests, COVID-19, the 2020 election, and more. So I hope if you've enjoyed this Ask Me Anything about the Barr testimony, and if you've been interested and felt illuminated by things we've discussed here, I hope you'll check out that book. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to all of you soon.